So I'm going to talk a little bit today about eating disorders and who they affect, talk a bit about seriousness and impact. If everybody's happy and I've got time, and Jim might have to stop me, I'm going to have a little bit of a personal conversation with you about my thoughts around the obesity messaging that we're currently getting and how they impact on the community and eating disorders. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about therapy, how to access, and in particular focus on the eating disorder item numbers from the Medicare benefits schedule. So I hope that's okay for everybody. Can I just also say thank you to all of you for attending, and I do hope that you find this presentation of interest and of some value. Now, it's hard to do in this circumstance, but usually when talking about eating disorders, I'd just like to get people to think a little bit about non-eating disorders. What does ordered eating mean? And of course, the point I'm trying to make is that we live in a world where disordered eating, a variety of different kinds, body image disparagement, fear of fatness, very unpredictable eating patterns, recurrent dieting, focus on shape and weight is the norm. And so, you know, sometimes I ask these questions, and how many people here are truly happy with their body shape? How many people currently think that they should lose some weight? Particularly relevant at the moment with COVID. We know that during COVID, binge eating and dietary restriction, and of course binge eating and dietary restriction, as I will emphasize the point, go hand in hand, and they've both increased in the community during Victorian lockdown. How many people here have ever been on a diet? How many people who have been on a diet have managed to successfully remain for a very prolonged period at that newly attained low weight? So just a few questions for people to think about with regards to themselves. No need to disclose to the rest of the audience. But I do want to make a critical point that dieting, restrictive food intake, is the single most significant risk factor for developing eating disorders. Dieting is not a normal part of adolescence or childhood, although it is increasingly becoming a regular behaviour at increasingly early ages in childhood. It is a risk factor to any growing or developing person in terms of risks for anxiety, depression, metabolic problems, nutritional difficulties, etc., etc. When we think about dieting, well, there's a whole range of things going on at the moment, isn't there? And I'll talk about some of them later. The issues around dieting's actually become entertainment, and it is certainly big business. There's a lot of money to be made from all sorts of both dieting clubs, but also dieting products. There's celebrity to be had if you can find your way into promoting a brand new way of doing dieting. We have a genuine problem with our public health issues at the moment. People are increasing in weight. And unfortunately, as I also will talk about a little bit, we've kind of forgotten some basic public health communication issues. And so we are currently targeting the outcome of, in terms of toxic fat. We're blaming the individuals who become overweight rather than looking at the underlying causes. And that leads to significant discrimination in our society against people who are overweight. There are a marked lack of fat role models in our society. And of course, so many people see that their self-worth, self-love, and love and worth from other people can come from looking good. Makeover shows, movies, magazines. It's a meme at the moment. It has been for many decades that people try and lose weight before they get married so that they look good for their photos. So we've got a whole load of things like that happening around why dieting is a big obsession at the moment. And not surprisingly, therefore, this has led to increasing disordered eating in Australia. And this is a lovely study by Philippa Hay, who's the Professor of Psychiatry at the University of New South Wales, a leading international expert and researcher in the field of eating disorders. And she's presents data here between 1995 and 2005. So it's a bit out of date now, but there's no reason to think that this still doesn't apply, in which the frequency that people binge eat, the frequency that people vomit, the frequency that people go for a day without eating, fasting, has either doubled or tripled over that 10-year period in Australia. And that's both for male participants and also female participants in that survey. And so disordered eating is on the rise. And this is disordered eating in young people, and you can see that it is particularly an issue for young people. I'm sorry about the busyness of these slides. You don't really need to pay too much attention to them, but essentially what you can see is that laxative use, diet pill use, laxative use, and have markedly increased. Self-induced vomiting has always been fairly high and continues to be reasonably high, particularly in younger females, and diuretic use, particularly in younger females, has also increased. Some really significantly serious and damaging behaviours that are changing in young people. So that's disordered eating behaviours. Now let's look at eating disorders. And this shows the prevalence of eating disorders only in Australian women, and in 2012. This is anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, and this was a diagnostic category called eating disorder not otherwise specified, which nowadays would include most people with binge eating disorder and bulimia nervosa, because the criteria have changed. So there's no EDNOS anymore. And the total prevalence of eating disorders in the population of Australian women looks like this. With it's predominantly a disorder of younger people, but as you can see here, there's a very, very large number of people who have eating disorders well into their middle age and later life. I should just talk about prevalence in men. We know that the prevalence in men is somewhere between 10 and 20 to 1, that increasingly men are now declaring that they have eating disorders, whereas once upon a time it was something that men tended not to come forward and seek help for. So there's an increasing recognition of eating disorders in men, and there's an increasing recognition now that eating disorders are occurring very, very early in people's lives, indeed, beginning at the age of 5 onwards. In terms of what anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder actually are, this is a slide I use to teach GPs and medical students. It's very simple, but actually I think it nicely encapsulates the differences. Essentially, anorexia nervosa is a condition where people restrict their food intake on a daily basis so that their calorie intake is very low and they lose weight and become very underweight. Bulimia nervosa is a condition where people constantly are dieting and restricting, but that's interspersed with episodes of binge eating, where they rapidly eat a large amount of food in a relatively discrete period of time, feel very uncomfortable afterwards, usually terrified, and that often leads to vomiting, laxative use, or fasting to try and control the effects of shape and weight on their, the effects of binging on their shape and weight. And binge eating disorder is where people are preoccupied with food, eating, constantly aware that they're restrained and not eating as much as they would like to be able to do, not giving themselves permission, and that translates into binges on a regular basis, but without the subsequent vomiting, laxative use or other weight control behaviours. So consequently, binge eating disorder, people with binge eating disorder tend to be at the top end of the normal weight range or overweight. People with bulimia nervosa tend to be within the normal weight range predominantly. How common is it? 9 in 1,000 women for anorexia nervosa, 3 in 1,000 men. 15 in 1,000 women for bulimia nervosa, 5 in 1,000 for men, so that's ratio 3 to 1, of course. And binge eating disorder, 35 in 1,000 for women, 20 in 1,000 for men develop binge eating disorder in their lifetime. Mean age of onset increases earliest in anorexia nervosa, latest in binge eating disorder. Just a bit more detail on that. Body image in all of these people tend to base their sense of self-worth, self-esteem around shape and weight and body image related issues, but underlying all of these disorders there's really low self-esteem to the extent of self-hatred. Loathing is really quite common, not always, but that's certainly a part of it. Intense fear of fatness is prominent in anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. And all of these disorders are associated with very important physical symptoms. The weight loss, of course, leads to starvation with all its associated effects. Bulimia nervosa leads to a whole load of changes, usually associated with the effects of laxatives or vomiting, but can also be directly associated with the effects of binging. And binge eating disorder, if you're overweight, then you have all of the problems, not only of bulimia, but including diabetes, osteoarthritis, high blood pressure. All of them, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail, are associated with high rates of depression, high rates of anxiety, sense of guilt, low self-esteem, etc. And relationships in all of these disorders are very significantly affected one way or another. In terms of the effects of starvation, the point I want to make from this slide is just that if you lose weight, losing weight becomes very self-generating for any of us, actually. But particularly if you're very vulnerable to becoming focused and preoccupied with weight and shape. But one of the problems with anorexia nervosa is that it becomes its own driver, so that once somebody has developed anorexia nervosa, their stomach shrinks. So if you're fearful of eating too much food and your stomach has shrunk, then as soon as you eat, you feel full, which immediately tells you, your sensory experiences that you've eaten too much, so you stop eating. So it's very hard to increase your food intake. You feel full for a very long time because your stomach slows down. So that feeling of having eaten too much lasts for a terribly long period of time, and again, causing a feedback loop that tells the person that they've eaten too much and need to slow down and cut back on their food intake. Otherwise, they'll put on too much weight and get fat, and all of those incredibly important fears that drive part of this illness. And if you lose weight and stop eating, then you actually develop malabsorption syndromes as well, so that when you do eat, you actually can't absorb the food as well as you would otherwise. And you also get effects like diarrhea and constipation, which are also kind of negatively reinforcing of eating. So there's a whole range of things around starvation that drive the disorder in a self-maintaining kind of cycle, as well as a whole range of psychological effects that, generally speaking, people associate with anorexia nervosa, but actually things that we would all develop if we stopped eating. We'd be anxious, irritable, obsessional, depressed, very concrete, rigid thinking, social withdrawal, loss of interest in sexual activity, increasing amounts of time spent thinking about food and cooking and food-related activities and food preparation and consumption, all of these other things as well. In terms of, effects of starvation, just talking a little bit about binging. So it's really important to understand that binges arise out of dietary restrictions. So you develop an urge to binge initially, at least, because you've not been eating adequately. And so you develop an overwhelming urge to binge. Now that binging might become self-driven as well, because it gives people a sense of release, it satisfies them. You get chemical changes in the brain as you binge, which are actually quite sedating and soporific. If any of you have eaten too much at Christmas, for example, you might recognize that. So although binging initially is about dietary restriction, it can also become self-generating. But I'll just put this up. This is an actual binge from somebody a long time ago now. And this occurs in somebody who is terrified of overeating and putting on too much weight. And you can see that this person ate what might have been an average meal, but then rapidly added in extra portions, then a new meal, then a new pudding, then a confectionery, then more sweets, then more food, then more food and more food. So an absolutely devastating kind of behaviour for somebody who actually ended up full of self-loathing and anger as a result of this loss of control of their eating once again. So an emotionally devastating illness that is often highly secretive from the people around you, so that you can't even get support from people because you're so ashamed of this behaviour. Spoke about comorbidity. These are anorexia and binge eating disorders, basically. And not surprisingly, they're all associated with a wide range of depression, addiction, bipolar, obsessive compulsive disorder, a little bit of overlap with autistic spectrum disorders, a little bit of overlap with ADHD as well. So really very large overlap with a lot of other disorders. It's very unusual for people to have a single eating disorder diagnosis and like comorbid diagnoses. And what do we know about the impact of these disorders? What we know is that anorexia nervosa, for example, has the highest mortality of any psychiatric disorder. So it kills more people than any other psychiatric illness per person that suffers from it. But 70% of people with eating disorders will have a very significant recovery. And one of the privileges for me of working in this area, I get to look after people who completely recover and go on to lead amazing, fantastic, really extraordinary lives, some of them, and certainly a lot of people with these disorders go on to lead the life that they want to lead and they choose to lead, and feel really very strong inside themselves after recovery. So there's a real kind of optimism that's genuinely based in looking after people with eating disorders. But at the same time, they are serious illnesses, very highest mortality in some people. And what we also know is that it's really important to identify and seek help early in the illness. The longer you have these illnesses, the more likely it is that they will persist and become self-maintaining and very, very difficult to shift and get better from. And it usually often takes quite a long time to recover. Anorexia nervosa, which is the template for the most severe illness, I often tell people, even when they're doing very well and really recovering extremely well, that the time scale for full recovery will be 2 years or more. And therefore, whenever doctors and families feel the need to do something straight away because somebody's so unwell, I actually think it's really important to try and help people contain that anxiety and think about what's going to be in the best long-term interest of the person who's got this illness, because the long-term interest is for them to recover fully. And we have no effective ways of making people get better from eating disorders. So the most important early thing that you can do is actually engage the person who's got these types of illness into some kind of discussion and treatment and recognition that there is a problem, identifying what the problem is as far as they're concerned, rather than what we think, and then work hard with the person to try and identify ways that what is troubling them about these eating problems can be resolved in a way that also leads to an engagement in what we know to be effective treatments. And we do know that we have very effective treatments for these illnesses. So because early recognition is important, we talk about the importance of recognising warning signs such as avoiding meals, slow eating, picking at food, eating in secret, cooking for other people but not for themselves, so cooking for everybody else but not eating any of it, denying being on a diet. Most people, when they're on a successful diet, will tell everybody about it. It's not quite the case in people with eating disorders. It's often very secretive, so food disappears from the fridge and nobody knows where it's gone, and there's no discussion about it. People leave the table immediately after food, for example, to go and purge or exercise. Refuse to eat in front of other people, focus only on low-calorie foods, and very restricted food intake are all common. But actually all of these things are common in everybody. So they're not specific, they're not that sensitive. If you see a lot of these things and you're very worried about somebody, they can help, but none of them are enough on themselves to make you anxious. What are the protective factors that can protect us from eating disorders? Well, we know that things that promote positive body image, things that help us critically process media images, which of course is a kind of something that it's all too late for me and my generation, but is increasingly important for young and part of the skill set of younger people. So positive body image, critical processing of media images, things that help people feel good about themselves, emotional well-being, self-direction and assertiveness, good social skills, good social functioning, helping people with really effective problem solving and coping skills are all protective factors. The absence of trauma from somebody's life, a protective factor. And the opposite of protective factors, of course, is vulnerability factors. And so in terms of opposite, low self-esteem, poor body image, acceptance of media images around body shape and weight, depression and anxiety, lack of assertiveness, a sense of being out of control and not able to control the world around you or make decisions yourself, poor social functioning, not being able to make friends, being bullied at school, trauma, difficulties with problem solving, all tend to be vulnerability factors for eating disorders. So I'm rapidly going through this. I hope this isn't too rushed. I hope I'm going through it quickly in order to give people a chance to ask questions and have a bit of a discussion at the end. So I hope that's working for you. What are the kinds of treatments for eating disorders that are out there? Well, again, there's some good news. There's good evidence to support a whole range of treatments for these illnesses. In people under the age of 18 years old, you will read and hear and be told that family-based treatment has the very best evidence in young children with anorexia nervosa. And that is absolutely the case. Family-based treatment essentially involves helping parents and siblings learn how to support somebody with anorexia nervosa, a young person, a child or adolescent with anorexia nervosa, to sit down at meal times and complete their meal intake on a regular basis with the least amount of emotional, intense emotion, negative emotion that can be achieved. And to do that every single meal, and gradually, as people begin to manage their food intake and restore their weight and health through adequate calorie and food intake, then gradually begin to do some psychotherapy with that individual in the family that usually involves family therapy plus individual therapy and getting the family to gradually give the person back control of the eating themselves as things go well. it's an extremely demanding process for families, for siblings, and for the individual with anorexia nervosa. And although it has the best evidence support, it's also important to know that many people can't engage with it. It doesn't work for them, it doesn't work for their family. It impacts so negatively on the rest of the siblings that you've got to make decisions as a family about what's best for everybody. And so you need alternatives to family-based treatment. And those alternatives are those that work for older people as well. Cognitive behaviour therapy, helping people manage their emotions, their thinking around food, weight, shape, body image, and their eating behaviours so that they establish good nutritional pattern themselves and take more and more control over their eating in order to restore their health adequately. Interpersonal therapy, which focuses on relationships and how they impact on eating disorders and how eating disorders have changed relationships and actually resolve them. And remarkably, the evidence for this is very strong, even though there's much less emphasis on eating behaviours. And specialist supportive clinical management, which is a particular type of case management that focuses on nutritional rehab and problem solving and illness self-management for individuals with eating disorders, all have really good evidence to support them in people with anorexia nervosa and binge type illnesses. The total number of sessions that you need of CBT is important to know. Somewhere between 20 sessions and 40 sessions is the number of hours of treatment somebody generally needs in order to recover from these illnesses. For people who've had very long-standing eating disorders over, a decade or more, then we know that focusing on complete cure and recovery is less effective for them than actually focusing on improving quality of life, addressing really harmful eating behaviours and other behaviours, so a kind of harm minimisation approach, and focusing on function, quality of life, social life, self-esteem and self-worth, and what matters to them in the world around them, and helping them achieve that is a much better and more effective approach for people with very long-standing illnesses. There's really no evidence to support the use of medications in anorexia nervosa, but in binge eating type disorders, bulimia and binge eating disorder, then there's some good pharmacological treatments out there that can really assist by reducing binge frequency, by increasing satiety so that you eat less, and reducing the urge to binge, which means that you binge less frequently. And so there is some good evidence for those medications, and they can make all the difference sometimes for people who are feeling overwhelmed and out of control with their eating disorder. In order to, medications can give people some sense of hope, some sense of control, and then enable them to engage with the evidence-based psychotherapies. So evidence suggests good quality, and so good quality psychotherapy though. So it needs to be really well done by well-informed specialists. We know that specialist care in this area is much more effective than non-specialist care. Important to treat comorbidities. Important always to work with that person to address what they find problematic, rather than addressing what you're worried about, and work closely with carers. Every carer I know where somebody has a significant eating disorder is affected by it and needs support and help themselves, or could benefit from support and help themselves. And links with, we've got some great non-government organisations. Jim, in his kind introduction, talked about my role with Butterfly Foundation, which is the national eating disorder support group. That has a lot of resources on their website, but in Victoria, of course, we have Eating Disorder Victoria, which is a sensationally helpful and very effective local state-based organisation for people with eating disorders or carers who are looking after somebody with an eating disorder. So I would recommend linking with them. Is there anything here that we need to talk about? The only thing I'd talk about here is, in terms of treatment, very rarely actually is treatment a one-stop shop. You start treatment with one person, you finish it in a certain number of sessions, and then you're better. There's some really nice work that shows that people who fully recover from eating disorders usually see a number of therapists rather than just one over a period of time, and they get something from each of those therapists. And it's the combination of all of the things that they've learned that helps them get better, but it is the person themselves that gets them better and drives it forward. So just an interesting finding from the research literature. GPs really a central role in helping people with eating disorders, both in terms of early detection, doing the initial validation and communication. So many people that I see talk about how they tried to talk with somebody, with a health professional, about their eating disorder, and that person knew so little about the eating disorder that they felt invalidated, rejected, disparaged, really felt disrespected. And so GPs are often really important in this area. And because eating disorders often require a dietitian, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and lots of physical health monitoring, a GP can be the right person to be the kind of central liaison person for that kind of team approach, as well as doing the important monitoring of physical health issues and supporting and linking families and patients with other support networks. So if there's any GPs in the audience, I hope there are, then an absolutely critical role. Okay, how are we going for time? We've got a few more minutes, I think. I think Jim said
we're fine. We're fine, Richard. As long as you want to continue, we're happy. But
don't
overdo it. You have a big day. You have a big day, I know.
I can go on. Okay, so just a little bit about obesity. I've made the point that one of the kind of central issues at the moment for our society is that we've, on the one hand, got this big public health issue around increasing obesity in the population. And obesity has increased 75% in the last 3 decades in adolescents. But also, we know that obesity is linked both with dieting and therefore leads to disordered eating and then eating disorders, and is also associated itself with high rates of disordered eating. 20 to 30% of all people who present with overweightness have some kind of eating disorder, usually binge eating. And if you look at people who are very overweight and need to attend for, weight loss clinics for gastric banding and things like that, then the rate of people with clear-cut forms of eating disorders is higher again. So eating disorders and obesity are linked, and the emphasis on blaming people with obesity for their own overweightness, focusing on all of the negative kind of aspects of eating of obesity, these kinds of things. These are, if you go online, this is a public health prevention series at the moment that talks about toxic fat in gravel guts. It's all disparaging and blaming and negative, and these tend to reinforce all of the body image disturbance, disparagement, fear of fatness that drives eating disorders, and that can be precipitated by simply going on a diet. So I think we kind of have a problem in this area, and unfortunately we don't have a really good solution for what to do about increasing rates of overweightness in the community. What we do know, however, is that going on a diet isn't such a great solution. 20% of people who go on a calorie restricting diet will achieve long-term weight loss, but 80% won't. And more importantly, from my point of view, 35% of people who go on a weight loss diet will actually gain a bit more weight than before they went on the diet after a year or two of being on that diet. So 35% gain weight. So, if we had a tablet that cured 20% of people but killed 35% of people, it would not get through the safety regulations. Honestly, it wouldn't. And yet here we've got a whole industry around dieting that is not based on great evidence. And some of this is important to think about in terms of who we are and how we're designed. And we're actually designed to eat everything that's put in front of us in periods where there's plenty of food around. But they were also designed to have prolonged periods where we've got to expend a lot of energy and activity in trying to find food. 50,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer type things. And where we are now, of course, is that the famine kind of thing isn't there. What we have instead is all of us choose not to eat food all the time. So we have restrained eating coexisting with the presence of lots of food and the lack of those periods of really intense famine and activity seeking food. So we've got no cycling of metabolic processes. Our fuel gets shunted straight into adipose storage and leads to diabetes and metabolic syndromes and all the rest of it. And so dieting doesn't work. We're in this funny situation where we live in a world where there's plenty of food all the time, so we're constantly not eating, like we're constantly going against our design parameters. And at the same time, we're in a world of increasing obesity, and this is some data from China between 1991 and 2001 for men and for women. And I think in 10 years, what you can see is this absolutely visible, easily visible shift in the body mass curve for Chinese adults. And if this is overweightness here, then I think you can see that in 1991, very few people were overweight, and in 2001, a huge shift in this massive population of people who are overweight. So we have a problem. Now, China's an interesting place because it has great data. And so what we know is we know what's happened to the food consumption in China over that 10-year period. And just to emphasize this business of why diets don't work, this is the average food intake between 1991 here and 2010 here, so over the same period. And what you can see is the food intake, the energy intake per person in China has decreased from 2,500 to less than 2,000 calories per day. And so in a period when the whole population of China, the weight has markedly and dangerously increased, the actual food and energy intake has dropped. Why is that? And why am I banging on about this when I say that dieting doesn't work? Well, it's not worked for this population. And we've got to think about the changes in the world around us. And so this slide encapsulates a little bit of what I think about what's going on here. And this is our diet spaghetti is exactly the same as our regular spaghetti. You plant, cultivate, harvest, and grind your own wheat before you get to eat it. And we're living in a world of increasing energy decrease. Our incidental energy output is dropping all the time, and that's what's happened in China. They've moved from a rural to an urban lifestyle, and in that move from a rural to an urban lifestyle, their actual energy expenditure has dropped more than their energy intake, and that's why they're gaining weight. And the challenge for us is, how do we help people feel good about not eating everything that's around them, despite that being their basic programming, not feel bad if they do put on weight, so that they then eat in order to make themselves feel better, which then makes them feel worse because they've put on weight. All of this kind of vicious emotional cycle of restrained eating, but also addresses the kind of community design for us that allows us to increase our incidental exercise again. Walking, walking more than parking. There's a lovely study to demonstrate this. Some of you here, I hope, are as old as I am, Jim, as maybe you can respond to this, and you would remember when phones were in a phone room, a telephone cupboard in your house, and when it rang, you had to get up and answer it, and you had to walk to it, and then walk back after you'd answered it. Now we have phones in our pockets and we don't have to move to answer them. But when they first introduced wireless phones that followed the person around rather than you having to get up to answer it, somebody did a PhD thesis that estimated how much energy consumption that would save over an average lifestyle. It was 11 kilograms of adipose tissue. So you think about that, and you think about remote controls, and you think about garage remotes, and you think about electric whisks and washing machines, and all of these things that once upon a time used to lead to incidental exercise. And there's something in here that we as a community need to think about. Sometimes I'm in danger of ranting about this because I'm so concerned that we still, we still have not found the community answer to this problem. But the answers that we've got at the moment tend to lead to blaming of people who are overweight and irresponsive dieting, which is ineffective, but does lead to an increase in eating disorders. So that's the link. Okay, how can you help people with eating disorders? Well, remember that the person is the person and that the eating disorder is not their identity. Be patient with people. Recovery takes time. And if you can't think of any other way to be with somebody who is frustrating and worried and distressed with an eating disorder, you can be kind to them. So it's one of the things that I constantly talk to my registrars and trainees about. If you really stuck, just be kind, be patient and kind. Communicate openly without judgment or negativity. Let the person speak and listen about how they're feeling. Don't focus on food and weight if you can, but talk about feelings that underline the disorder, and be optimistic and draw attention to the person's positive attributes. Remember, early intervention is important, but actually many people with eating disorders don't really want treatment, so not pushing them into treatment, but working with them to identify the things that are troubling them, and then helping them identify a way to seek help for the things that are troubling them. Use I statements rather than you statements. I'm worried about you. It's my problem. I'm worried about you. I have seen this or that, and that's made me worried. Could we please talk about it? Help them feel safe to talk to you, talk about feelings, give them time, listen, encourage to seek help. Help if you are somebody with an eating disorder, then recognize that it does have an impact on your family or other people around you and makes them anxious. If you are trying to support somebody who's supporting somebody with an eating disorder, keep the messages simple, be optimistic, encourage help seeking, listen, be kind. I think I've said all of this before. So just finally, I'll just finish on, in the last year, there's been a big change in Medicare benefits schedule. And once upon a time, you could only get 10 psychological sessions of treatment. And as I've said, eating disorder therapies, we know, takes between 20 sessions for a relatively mild disorder and 40 sessions for a severe disorder. And after intense lobbying of the government, they have responded to that with a new Medicare benefit schedule specifically for eating disorders that enables people to have up to 40 evidence-based psychotherapy sessions and up to 20 dietetic sessions, provided they meet certain criteria that's supported by a GP, and for the extended 40 sessions, a psychiatrist or pediatrician. And they're available for anybody with anorexia nervosa and for people with relatively severe bulimia nervosa or binge eating disorder. And that severity is determined by an assessment and a questionnaire score that can be done by your GP if you need it. And those 40 sessions are available in any 12-month period. and it requires you to get help from particular evidence-based treatments, CBT, FBT, specialist supportive clinical management, as we've discussed. And finally, I just want to talk about a really exciting thing that is part of every state, or every large state in the country has been funded by the federal government to develop a residential day program for eating disorders. People who know me know that I've been talking about day programs and residential programs now for 25 years around eating disorders. Butterfly currently developing their own residential program up on the Sunshine Coast. It will be opening early next year for people with eating disorders, in which they will be supported in a non-clinical environment to access effective evidence-based care with really high staff to client ratios based on a model out of America called the Montenegro model that works on supporting people in a therapeutic milieu, manages medical complications, helps people find autonomy, control, and pace their own recovery, gives them choice, put a container around that choice, and is in just a beautiful, beautiful part of the world, in a building that I think gives people not a sense of punishment or failure, but a sense of privilege and care, which, as I've emphasised, is so important in helping people get better. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Other than to remind people that if you do want to access further information about eating disorders, contact Eating Disorders Victoria or contact the Butterfly Foundation on their 24-hour helpline, which is here. Thank you very, very much for your attention and for giving me this opportunity to talk.